We had previously discussed the next generation matrix and the basic reproductive number, and now this is a continuation on this topic. And in fact, we're going to be very specific in learning one of the algorithms or one of the methods used for the calculation of this quantity, something that applies for compartmental models, models that are described by systems of ordinary differential equations. So here we're going to see how this calculation relies on computing eigenvalues of a matrix, and kind of the science here is putting together this matrix, the so-called next generation matrix. But before we jump in to these technical details, we start this lecture with nothing less than this. Let me just read this to you. The deeper understanding Faust sought could not from the devil be bought, but now we're told by theorists bold, all we need to know is are not. These are not my own words. These are the words of Bob May, and I figured that perhaps you'd like to share opening this lecture um, with these words. There are the literature on the basic reproductive number is extensive. This is a key quantity in the mathematical modeling context of infectious disease and epidemics. And I mentioned here in this slide briefly two main references. You will see in some of the recommended reading, some of the required reading, that there are more references. So we had seen this definition before, but let's make sure we are on the same page. The basic reproductive number, R naught or R0, is an average. Is the average number of secondary infections produced by an infective that is introduced or immersed into a completely susceptible population. Sometimes this infective who starts the outbreak or the epidemic is referred to as the index case. You may find these exact words. This is a quote from a paper by Van den Driest and Wadmoth from 2008. And another paper by Histerbeek. There are there is also reference to the context of R naught in demography and in ecology, where R naught is interpreted as the expected number of female offspring born to one female during her entire lifetime. In many of these mathematical models in ecology, the time evolution of a particular species relies only on modeling the females, since they are the only ones that give offspring, and therefore that's what keeps the species going. So, but um, the these are very two very relevant definitions to our discussion today. So, what we would like to keep in mind is that this quantity serves as a quantification on the number of secondary cases, but it also provides a threshold condition. And this threshold condition is around 1. So when R naught is less than 1, we are going to think of the scenario in which the infectious individuals, in fact, the infection, is incapable of taking off. This is an area in which the epidemic dies off. There is actually no outbreak, no epidemic. And what's happening is that these infectious individuals that are passing on the pathogen, they fail to rep replicate or replace themselves. You would like to think of this as the offspring of the infectious individuals, and if on average they don't produce more than one secondary infection, then that's the idea of being destined to die off. However, when R naught is exceeding 1, then the number of infected individuals will increase, and this is the scenario we typically call an epidemic or an outbreak. So this is a threshold parameter in the context of mathematical models for infectious diseases, but it's important to remark that for the invasion of a disease organism, the invasion in the sense of how this pathogen would basically invade or take over a population that is naive in the sense of being completely susceptible. This idea of R naught, it's something that applies exactly in that time of window when the invasion is being attempted. But once the disease has begun to spread, the conditions favoring the spread will change, and R naught is not longer a good measure of transmission. And instead, one must turn to other quantifications of transmission that are indeed time dependent. And before we dive into some of these details involving matrices and eigenvalues, let's quote some extremely simple mathematical model for keeping track of the of one population. So we use here n of t to denote the size at time t of some population, and we are going to write an expression for the rate of change in population size. Here we rely on having in the model a term for birth and another term for death, right? This is the simplest description of the rate of change of population size. The notion is you consider the births and you subtract the birth. The births are going to have a positive effect on the rate of change, and the deaths are going to have a detrimental effect. Births are like new arrivals into a population, and the deaths are departures, right? So we can write mathematically expressions of this sort, where we here assume that this is the simplest way of formulating um, this type of vital dynamics. And then we would say B denotes the per capita birth rate, and D denotes the per capita death rate. And by writing these expressions, we're saying that these processes, the birth process and the death process, each of them is proportional to the total population size. Okay, we'll keep this in mind because what we're going to see next is going to relate to this very simple formulation. So, in the spirit of carrying out the calculation of this R naught, we have to convert the epidemiological model, which already we're assuming we're working with a deterministic model described by a system of ordinary differential equations where there are compartments, compartments defined in terms of the infection process or the epidemic process. So what we need to do is to relabel and agree on basically two sets of compartments. One of the sets is going to include compartments for disease or disease compartments, where individuals in those compartments are hosting the pathogen. Therefore, they're infected. And these compartments are going to include individuals that have been exposed or are undergoing latency. Um, that means they are infected but not infectious. Then when they progress into the stage of being capable of transmitting, passing on the pathogen, they are considered infectious. And then there are other individuals that show symptoms, other individuals that do not show symptoms. All these individuals will be considered part of the compartments that are disease compartments. And then you can have the rest of individuals into other compartments that are not disease. So mathematically, and this is where we start throwing notation, we're going to say, all right, we're going to sort this into n disease compartments and m non-disease compartments. So we're going to denote x. We're going to use x here in vector form, saying, okay, x stores n compartments. They are including those with disease, different stages of disease, and then we stack everything else into the variable y. Okay. Now we are going to define an operator. Think of operators as somehow functions on a higher dimensional space, or functions defined on spaces of functions and so on. So an operator here, F, is going to denote the rate of secondary infections, um, so that this is keeping track of an increase on the ith disease compartment. And V, okay, so we are heading here towards something that makes a complete analogy with the birth and death process we just discussed. We just mentioned the birth and death, that we have births as arrivals and deaths as departures, right? So when we are able to separate, segregate, decompose the mathematical model into disease compartments, now what we'd like to keep track for this variable x, we're going to have a notion of arrivals and departures. And those arrivals are going to be related to the increment on secondary infections. And V, so that's going to be the gain or the arrivals for those disease compartments. And here the operator V is going to denote different types of progression, death, recovery, and so on. Okay, so this allows to write the original model into a new form where we have state variables here in terms of the disease compartments, x sub 1, sub 2, sub 3, all the way through x sub n, and all those compartments can be written in terms of f minus v, but this f being an operator, right? And then we stack everything else here into this typically nonlinear um, map or operator denoted by G. Okay, so this is the model we had originally, but reorganized or rewritten. So these operators, F, fancy F and fancy V, as I would call them, they are resembling gains and losses in disease compartments. And that's the analogy with the birth and death process. Okay, so the composition of the dynamics of the mathematical model into F and V, and the designation of compartments as infected or infected may not be unique, right? So that's something to keep in mind. We're gonna take a little pause here, and we will continue this conversation on the next slide.